Hello and welcome to Illustration 101. I'm Taylor Payton, and I've been a freelance illustrator and concept artist for going on 8 years now. Basically, Illustration 101 is a course that I've designed to help you understand some of the most basic elements of picture making and illustration, specifically applied to creating final imagery using some of those foundational core principles. So let's just quickly run through the outline that I have for this course and what these different categorizations of color mean, and then we'll hop into the lessons and get them done as efficiently as we can while helping you learn the most possible. So first, this yellow box is the more informative part of the course. We will be laying down all the basics we need to start sketching. Sketching is red because it is the most fervent and the most strong and loose and quick format of the process. After which we sort of cool down a little bit and start working on our whip or our work in progress, finally coming into the final and finishing up with some effects just to give it that extra pop. So without further ado, let's get through the information portion where we'll cover all of the basics of illustration and how you can get into the process, and then we'll actually demonstrate how you can begin sketching very assiduously. All right, welcome to another lesson of Illustration 101. In this one, we're going to quickly run through the definition of illustration, and then we're going to talk about the various types of picture planes we might utilize and how their formatting will affect our illustration. So first, illustration is basically a picture or a diagram that helps make something clear or attractive. So we really just want to create an attractive image or picture, sometimes with a little bit of diagrammatic elements. It's also the action of illustrating or the condition of being illustrated, which of course is pretty clear or obvious, as the term would imply in illustration. Next, we have these types of canvases. We have portrait, landscape, and square. So square is really good for social media. It's just something that has the same dimensions, obviously, on both sides, like if it's 2 by 2 or what have you. Next, we have landscape, which is more horizontal than vertical. And we have portrait, which is more vertical than horizontal. Portrait, you will see things like portraiture, drawing somebody you might have sitting for you as we sort of sketch in a figure. And we also have landscapes, wherein you might want to draw some interesting shapes across the picture plane that will allow you to give a sense of space or vastness. So these are really good and classic, and they've been used for centuries. The square is a little less common, but you can still design relatively well within it. It just has different principles to apply. So now that we've gotten an understanding, or at least a basic understanding, of the different types of dimensions we can use for our illustrations, let's move on. Hey, welcome back. Next, we're going to be talking about pictorial elements. First, we'll talk about lines and how lines kind of play their role on the picture plane. Lines actually have many roles, one of them being for subdivision, like you see me doing here, just taking these vertical lines and running them through in order to create sort of a grid-like pattern. Subdividing the picture plane, this is very common in order to create focal points. This isn't an exact rule of thirds, but if you're familiar with that compositional tool, it's basically the eye going to the intersections in order to create the point that it wants to look at. But that's a little bit more down the line. For now, no pun intended, just think about lines in terms of being able to break up the picture plane for one and deciding what areas you may want to place certain things in. So you may want your figure over here, and they could be reclining. Have the arm go down into this section, and maybe another arm over there, and leaving enough space around the figure. But you see, I'm also using lines in order to gesture. I'm using these lines to create different demarcations or places where I know I want elements to go or to be. So, for example, this is a female figure, and I'm using lines, such as these lines right here, to say, well, the eyes are going to go here, and the nose is going to go here. This is the shape of the hair, which brings me to my next point, which are shapes. Shapes are what we use to say that these lines have enclosed a certain area. So I'm going to switch to the color yellow here for the shapes. And this is one shape as an example. It is her upper piece of clothing, which we haven't decided on yet, but we understand the shape of it. We don't need all the details at this point. Another might be the hair, as we mentioned, so I'll just switch the color again here. And then you can see that as I fill in some of the areas where my lines have laid down, I start to get shape. And when you have line and shape working with one another, whether those lines are vertical and horizontal in order to create different areas and subdivisions on the picture plane, or they are gestural in nature and meant to expose where your boundaries are, where your contours are of, say, a figure or a machine or a tree, anything of that nature. Lines are one of the greatest tools for many, many purposes as an artist, and as you learn to develop your drawing ability, you will learn to leverage lines in several ways. For example, I just used this line to denote where the arm would be kind of going as a trajectory. But let's say that that's all I needed to know in order to create a larger shape. So as you see, I'm working with a very large brush now, which has an easier time making shapes than it does lines. And that's useful because oftentimes we will be switching between our lines and our shapes on the picture plane in order to create interesting illustrations. So once you understand lines and you know how to work with lines as far as being able to enclose space and to gesture out figures or to clean up those lines later using even more crisp and designed lines, and you understand how shapes are enclosures of space that allow you to start to convey a language on the picture plane. We're just going to skip forward really quick and talk more about values now. I've added another element of her arm reaching up to the top of the canvas, even though obviously it's very sketchy. As far as values go, it's the relative brightness or darkness of any given line or shape as it applies to the picture plane. So the shape being the darkest, this is in the middle ground somewhere, and this is the lightest. I applied the middle ground to approximately the skin color. I applied the darkest to the shirt, and I applied the lightest to the hair. And this allows us to have contrast, and we want to create contrast through value patterns. Value patterns are things like the rhythm between the middle ground of values, the dark values, all the way up to the brightest value, which is white, and maybe a light gray as well. So there are different types of value patterns and value scales, all of which we will get more into later as we start thumbnailing and sketching and working on our final illustration for the course. But for now, this is just an overview of the contrast that you can create with values. Just before we wrap up here, the darkest value being black, the lightest value being white. So if I were to quickly switch the background here to say almost the lightest gray possible, you can see that if I wanted to use white, I now can because white was occupied by the background before. So let's say we want to add the most contrast around the face and split the head into two values. This is just an example. You would have to work on that idea some more. But as far as using white, this is creating the most value contrast. Now, you can't help but look right here because it's the most jarring visually. It's the most standout element. So that's just how you can use values in one capacity. But again, we will talk more about the relative brightness or darkness, how to make them into gradients and smooth them across various areas for shading. Mixing values in line, all things we will cover down the line again, to use the pun. But yeah, let's just keep proceeding and learning more about various elements of illustration. In this next exciting installment, we're going to be talking about the greats, first from the past, and then a couple from modern day. So first, let's talk about the greats from the past. We have, first and foremost, J.C. Leyendecker from the golden age of illustration. So you can see 1928 right here. So it was at not too far after the turn of the century, just a third of the way through. And we can see the beautiful, illustrious elements here. You can see some circles enclosing the figures, the heads of the figures. You can see some horizontal lines running through here. Both figures somewhat triangular in their composition. This man in a wider triangle, this man in sort of a more narrow one. We also see that we have rectangular elements, and it's a vignette of an illustration, meaning it doesn't have every single things spelled out for you. It's just a couple different contextual items on the picture plane. But you can really see the shapes here, and you can really see the line work as well, which makes it a really great example. So here's just another one, much more involved, but still a vignette. We don't have an actual background. It is just a figure, or rather two figures enclosed in a circle, atop a frightened looking horse. And again, just very, very beautiful, very, very delicate and strong and graphic. You can see the vertical element here. So that's basically a vertical line turned into this kind of banner. Another circular element to draw the focus and kind of create that wheel of motion for the eyes. We have a smaller circle up here with the small cherub. And then we have a curved line running around the banner and just tying all of this together. So again, very beautiful, immensely illustrious, and a great example. Next, we'll talk about Alphonse Mucha, I believe it's pronounced. It could be Mucha. But either way, Alphonse M. We have the wonderful Art Nouveau style, which really includes a lot of strong and intricate line work. So you can see a very big outline here, all the way around the figure, which is in profile. Again, we see that circular element coming in, broken up with even more circles. And then we have some of these other shapes, which are basically just subdivided into ornate patterns, wherein we're just creating some nature inside of them. At the bottom here, we have more circles and also some more curved lines that kind of form into circles. Circles are a huge element of illustration, whether they are subtle or very at the fore, like this. Let's look at this one right here, where there's less circular elements, but you can see there's lots of rectangles, a couple curved lines. All of it is enclosed within a sort of rounded rectangle that is broken up by the font or the text. So there's lots of different types of illustration. These are just some of the older, more beautiful masters that were pivotal in developing the field. And I just wanted you to see that all of these things are at play here. We have lines, we have, in this case, more shapes and tones, but Mucha did paint as well. So lastly, let's just take a look at some of these diagonal lines, which I feel are important to point out as well. So you can find diagonals for their dynamism and their ability to move things around. They also feel less stable than vertical or horizontal lines, but then you also have curved lines for the feminine figure. So as you see that these different types of lines work in certain ways to give you certain ideas, you'll begin to deploy them appropriately as well, just like the masters are doing here. Let's talk about the present day masters. We have James Jean. So very complex, very beautiful imagery, lots of curved lines in the floral elements, spanning into some more curved lines in the tigers, albeit less curved than all of this flow and sort of circular bulbs at the very end. Just a lot of curves here, but you can see in the background, if you look closely, James Jean has broken up all of this curvaceousness with some diagonals and some dynamism. So a very chaotic image that has been composed beautifully by making sure that all of the shapes have their own enclosures with line, and that we have some gradients here. We can take a look at the values quickly. If we just switch them to grayscale for a moment here. And you can see that without color, this image still reads. You have your dark bulbs, you have your lighter bulbs, you have the whites of the tiger, which are sort of hidden. It's not too obvious like it is here, where the separations are much, much crisper, but you still have a lot of organization in terms of the value structure. And again, using those straight lines to give more weight to all of the curves and all the diagonals going on here. Here we have another bright, beautiful image by the one and only James Jean. Again, the lines are pretty much near perfect and immensely thin, very, very delicate, and very good for making sure that everything has its own shape, everything has its own enclosure. It makes things very easy to color down the line, albeit it still takes quite a bit of time, which is just part of the process. You also can see that there's plenty of curved elements, but we also balance that out with some straighter, more hard-edged elements. So again, circles, diagonals, not a lot of verticals, not a lot of straight lines here, just a whole lot of flow. Let's go to something a little more representational, a little less surreal. We have Peter Morbacher's work, a lot more of a fantasy influence here, in addition to a lot of the old master type painting that we also can see. There's not a lot of lines at all in terms of being able to show line work, but what you will notice is that the shapes are still very easy to read, like this wing or the head or this particular set of armor here, the horn of the goat. All of these things are still very separate and very clear. And you have a lot of diagonal elements. You know, the cliff is diagonal. Let me just grab a color here. You have a lot of diagonal elements. The cliff is diagonal. The legs are running at diagonals. The sword is diagonal. And then you have these curved elements that bring you in as well. You also have the wings to help frame the figure. So again, a very beautiful composition, very strong. The most vertical element, which isn't perfectly vertical, is the figure. So lots of ways to use lines to break this up and understand it better. And then we also have this other piece where the figure is more curved, but you see these strong graphic shapes making a comeback as well. You have this lunar shape, the inverted triangles, and you have the diagonal of this particular wand element. Finally, we can see that there's a slightly more vertical element, but still curved, which is the tree in the foreground. And then you have these triangular mountainous shapes that jut out and point you upward toward the figure in addition to these triangular trees. So lots of triangles, lots of circles, all of the basics that you're going to find in any beautiful illustration, which we will, of course, be deploying down the line and showing you when and where to use these things. I just wanted to give you a breakdown of people who are at a very high level, very masterful, doing this and using these principles because they are the concepts that will carry your illustrations into stronger and stronger territory. That said, you can feel free to check out their work. Peter Morbacher has angelarium.net and James Jean has jamesjean.com. Of course, check out the old masters as well from the golden age of illustration or from the Art Nouveau age, which Mucha helped pioneer. So these are very, very potent, very good study material and very good reference material as you move forward. You can glean a lot by taking these apart in terms of the fundamentals I'll be teaching you and applying them to your own work. All right, now we find ourselves knee-deep in the illustration basics. So right now we're just going to be covering a little more detail about what goes on inside this magical, mystical box that is the picture plane. Basically, we discovered and talked about some of those things earlier. What I want to denote next is foreground, middle ground, and background. So this is going to be really helpful for you moving forward if you don't already have a vague notion, at least, of these three magical keys to creating depth inside of this picture plane. The foreground is basically what appears at the forefront or frames the thing or objects or elements closest to the viewer. So if we have this subdivision right here, first and foremost using a very ugly, squiggly, I'm just teaching you line, we next have the middle ground, which might exist somewhere along this picture plane. Then we can break it up just a little bit to give an interesting amount of depth. And then lastly, we will jump into the background. So the background could be, say, just a bunch of spiky yellow triangular mountains or trees or whatever shapes you'd want to fill in back there. So this is a really simplified kind of separation. If I could just quickly do a different foreground, we can change that element. So let's say in the foreground we just have this gigantic kind of vertical mountainous shape. And because it is the foreground, we would not be seeing anything that's going on behind it. So we used a line to denote that foreground. What I'm going to do next is just fill that in roughly. And then we have our foreground, which I'll drive to the top there layer-wise. We have our midground, so just lighten the color a little bit. And really quickly, using the polygonal lasso tool, just outline where that shape would be filled. And let's drop it below that layer so we can keep the lines. And then at last we have our background, which I will use the color of the sky for. And that's just going to drop right back there. So we now have some separate elements on our picture plane, and these elements being the foreground, midground, and background. So the foreground is what is closest to the viewer, and we can work within this large kind of shape idea to keep on blocking out areas that feel like they're closer to us. They're much nearer to our looking glass, our window that is the picture plane. So whatever they may be, they could be rocks, they could be trees, they could be practically anything as long as they are nearest to us. Like for example, I'm seeing some cactuses come out now. And you can start as rough as you want really with illustrations and thumbnails and whatnot, and then just begin to define the rest of it later. So it helps if the foreground is overlapping some of those background elements. We could also kind of eat up all of the ground there, which actually makes the space feel a little too closed. So we can delete some of it and let a little bit of a window into the middle ground, because otherwise our frame was a little too strong there. So basically now we have somewhat of a developed foreground. We can then take that idea and move it to the middle ground. So in terms of the middle ground, I'm seeing sort of a cliffside here that sort of takes us to the background. So instead of kind of taking that cliffside element out, I'm going to keep it so that we can define the middle ground a little bit more. This is also a great way of just breaking up your flow or your working process, because you can start off with usually the background and then work your way to the middle ground and then to the foreground. I went opposite in this case, and you can really do whatever you want as far as your process is concerned, but it helps to just break them up into 3 separate chunks that you can handle. So I'm mostly just creating the fills on these for not only to denote the shapes and hammer that point home so that we don't just work with line purely, but also to help show you that a full picture can be composed with just these 3 elements basically. The mountains and the sky are the background. That whole ground plane, which we don't have any additional detail on yet, is the middle ground, and then all of the mountainous areas are sort of where the cactus kind of lie, is the foreground. So now if we zoom out, we get sort of a very rough idea of this landscape, which is obviously incredibly stylized and ridiculous, but it's really just to show the principles. It's really just to show the concepts of having something closest to the viewer, something they can kind of walk into, and something they can see far out toward. it really invites people into your picture plane. And in this case, we used a landscape format, so I went with a quick landscape. And this is really just a set of ideas. And I can show you later that if we take even this same picture and break apart the elements therein, we can begin to create something that's much more polished and refined. But it's just nice to be able to lay out ideas as long as you understand the concepts, FG, MG, BG, background, middle ground, foreground. All right, in the next little module here, we will be talking about the focal points, some of the types of elements, and some themes and ideas. All right, so maybe you've got an idea of foreground, middle ground, and background, but what if you forgot to define a focal point? So a focal point is basically the area of the picture plane that you want your viewer's eye to go to. And in this case, if we squint, it kind of looks to me like my eye goes straight to the mountains because they're yellow, they're very warm, they have a lot of contrast. So in this case, the image would basically be not as strong as it could be, simply because we're not framing the mountains as effectively as we could, we're not leading to them as best we can, and they just sort of stand there very starkly, but they don't have a lot of elements supporting them. So it's nice to have a focal point, but you want to make sure you have other types of elements that support them, such as elements that frame, elements that lead, elements that give context. We're going to be breaking down all of that as we proceed, basically, in terms of our illustration process. So let's just get rid of this demo illustration. We may return to it later, we might not. But as far as focal points go, let's start off defining one. So let's say we want the focal point to be a crashed kind of ship. So just quickly sketch sort of a broken ship here. And it's just busted up. Maybe it's a fresh crash site. So this will be the ship. Kind of looks like the gummy ship from Kingdom Hearts, if you ever played that game, the first one they give you. Anyway, so we have the crash site here. Have some shadows underneath the ship wings, kind of help pop it out from the background, which we need to define still. So maybe we see where it crashed. Just using a nice line across the picture plane to infer sort of a background, and we can infer even more of one too. So we can see the crash line where it kind of tore up the terrain. And we're just weaving a little story using these elements, but we're thinking in line this time. We're not thinking in those big shapes like we were with the other demonstration. So we can just keep on adding nice big messes to the foreground. Maybe it hit a really big rock and that was the element that stopped it. So we can kind of take that element maybe to right here and then give the rest maybe a little room to breathe. So we don't have any value separations yet, which would really help to give us a clear idea of how to proceed with this image. However, we do have a lot of types of elements. So let's talk about those elements. We have the ship itself, which its shape is different than pretty much anything else around it. We have some sort of trapezoidal wings, one of which can be going off the picture plane a little bit. If your idea gets a little too big for the picture plane, that's fine, especially when you're sketching. You can always obviously adjust later. So just like that, fill in other areas you want to fill in just to make sure you get what you're looking for in terms of that contrast. So at any rate, we have the ship, which is the focal point, very clearly. It's different than anything else on the canvas, and I'll zoom out just to emphasize that. We also have sort of the rubble it created as it crashed. We have the large-scale mountain that it ran into to stop all of that momentum. And we have the midground and background planes, or ground planes, which actually showcase its sort of crash sequence in a way. They showcase the areas where it rode along the ground before coming to a halt here. And it's really very vague in the background right now. We just have that nice big rectangular separation. But if we want to frame that ship even more, we could just bring in some other elements. Maybe it's a very closed range of mountains, kind of like the Grand Canyon. So just sort of draw those out. And this would be the real area where it just opens up very slightly back there. But basically, I just wanted to add some diagonal elements to add a little more uncertainty to the image, as well as give a stronger background. So we broke up all these different shapes using the foreground, middle ground, and background planes. And we focus on what types of elements we could include on our picture plane so that we have an interesting composition that would tell a story. Now, just looking at a crashed ship, unless the ship itself is very impressive, we might want to keep pushing this even further, and then we'd have to start thinking about things like themes and ideas. So as far as themes and ideas go, you can mix and match your genres. So for example, if this were science fiction, I may want to bring in some sort of interesting abstraction or people or portraits. I mean, portraits wouldn't really work for this one because it's a landscape format for one, which makes it a little bit harder to do portraits. You can still do them, but it doesn't really vibe with the rest of the subject matter. But maybe it's a Western. Maybe there's a cowboy standing up here, like on top of the mountain, just sort of looking down at what happened. He's just taking his burro out for a walk or whatever. Or maybe it's a girl. Maybe it's a female cowboy. So we're just adding other areas of interest here so that we could potentially really increase the interest and narrative that's at play. So this figure is obviously a little large in terms of scale. We'll talk about scale later. I also just want to put her on a separate layer. So maybe the ship is huge. You see immediately when I change her scale, everything else changes as well. So we have this nice big mountain ground plane that she's sort of standing on. She's not in perspective right now, but again, we'll talk more about that later. And she's looking at the ship, and maybe there's other beings, coming out of the ship, or maybe the ship is very detailed, and that's why it's nice to look at. But regardless, it starts to give more of a narrative, and it helps expand upon our themes and ideas. So now we're mixing, science fiction and Western a little bit, and that's already more intriguing than just your classic, oh, the ship crashed kind of image. So that's basically it for the types of elements you can include on the picture plane. We started with a focal point. We talked about all the different elements that we use to get this whole big space filled up so it's not so intimidating and art block facilitating. And now we can start talking about other things as we move forward in our illustrative journey, learning all these elements and ideas that can really help expand upon our illustration prowess. So there's other types of elements that we can talk about quickly. We have the figure, we have the ground, and we have the surrounding objects and the ambiance. So the figure is right here. There can be multiple figures, obviously. Then you have the ground plane, which exists here, here, and here. And also there's background and foreground, middle ground, and background. Of course, we talked about those, so all the different types of grounds. We have surrounding items, objects, and ambiance. So there's the trail from the crash. There's the debris that was kicked up and shoveled forward by the physical body of the ship. And that's just adding some extra story and detail and ambiance. We could have, for example, in the ambiance category, we could have some smoke coming out of the ship from various areas. And I'll just fill that in quickly so as to showcase, it's not doing that good. It stopped long enough for the smoke trails to be going upward as opposed to another direction, which is something to think about. We're always thinking about the physics of the picture plane, but already you can see that those elements just make the idea way more uncomfortable already. If we added fire, that's another way to create a sense of urgency, but the feelings are changing, the vibrations are changing as we look through this little window of an illustration, just based on these ideas and themes that we are working with. So you want to make sure that you're considering things like the figure, like the grounds, like the surrounding items or objects or ambiance that will really help to add tons of intrigue to whatever illustration you're creating. All right, so we're coming into this lesson with some prompts. Now, these prompts are meant to stimulate mental imagery. Mental imagery, kind of, your imagination machine, that thing inside your head that gives you pictures. So you can think of like a top hat, a hot rod, a coil, or any of these things, and when you read them enough, your brain will start to form images, and then you start to transpose those images into things that others can see. So singed, for example, we could take, a figure that's sitting there and maybe they're looking down. Nah, I already don't like that drawing. Don't be afraid to get rid of something if it doesn't work right away. Like right off the bat, you lose almost no work, and it's just not worth it to try and start off with a bad drawing. But if we were to work with singed, we could have this really rough figure here. I'll just put him right in the middle of this square and a little down so I have some room on top. But singed, we could have the top of his head be burnt. So I'm using a shape now. I'm using a large brush to kind of create a difference in value, which helps to enunciate the focal point. And we could, again, have sort of a smoke coming from it, which is a theme that's just emerging a lot lately, but that's just how the cookie kind of crumbles. You can see that this figure has been singed on top, and it's a thumbnail. It's a idea that we can then use to elaborate upon, which we are going to be talking more about later, and later being specifically this lesson in this case. So let's just jump into talking about thumbnails while we're on the subject. I'm going to move these two things aside and showcase some thumbnails that I made in 2020. Now, these are ideas that I created based on a small project I'm developing. Now, this project has characters I've already fleshed out and ideas I've already thought over many, many times, so it was easy to think about how would these characters play around in these thumbnail settings. That's basically creating different shaped picture planes and then going in and filling them out with those elements and ideas and foregrounds and middle grounds and backgrounds, but it's also vague and loose that you still have tons of fun figuring out how you're going to make these elements work as a fully fledged illustration. So, for example, this one's pretty simple. It's portrait format. There are two figures, just a male figure and a female figure, kind of sitting close and talking. It could be a little bit romantic. There could be a little bit of chemistry, and that's always fun to watch and fun to look at. We watch lots of shows like that. Or we have picnic, in which case you can see it's an above view and everybody's just digging into the box of food. And that, of course, is always fun to look at as well. So it's trying to figure out with these really small, almost thumbnail-sized sketches, what you're going to be doing inside that big, intimidating picture plane. And that is really how we can begin to plan our illustrations quite well and end up working 100 hours on something that works rather than spending, 100 hours on something that doesn't, which is kind of soul crushing as an artist. And you got to get over that too, because it's going to happen. But we can avoid a lot of it if we plan smart. So basically, we can just take inspirations and notes from our daily life to help inform some of our drawing. That's just something that's helpful as well. Or you can use random generators online like artprompts.org. Artprompts.org is a good random generator. So these are all just ways of getting ideas and showcasing thumbnails that you can use to work out those ideas. Because once you've worked out your ideas, then you have a fully fledged piece. Even though this one is something that I would work out even more so, this is like the next level up from a thumbnail. It's a sketch with color. So this is a colored sketch, which it was something that was pushing my abilities at the time because I really don't do this angle very often, and to try and seat figures in it is difficult. And there's some things that I would definitely change if I were to turn this into a fully fledged, gorgeously rendered piece. But at the same time, it's really helpful to know the layout already. The information has become clearer based on that initial thumbnail, which was just this picnic thumbnail right here. So you see that I had the rough idea of how the characters would be laid out, and I pretty much followed that. I had an idea of, just a box the food was in, which also got denoted. And then it's just transposing this rough idea into this less rough idea, because this is a lot easier to tell what's going on for everybody involved, myself included. But I still am going to be teaching you how you can take those rough ideas and turn them into more polished ones. So that pretty much wraps up this module. Let's get into some actual sketching and juicy process stuff. So just a quick recap, in less than an hour, we have covered all of this yellow area right here. Everything from the canvas shapes and formats, the elements, some of the grates, talking about the picture plane, focal points, all of this good stuff. We have now kind of given ourselves an overview, which we can use to extrapolate upon the sketching phase, which we are now entering. So in terms of the sketching phase, the first thing we want to start doing is choosing the best thumbnail. But as you can see, there are no thumbnails present. So what we'll have to begin doing is to create some. So we can just make any sort of bounding box we want in terms of our picture planes, in terms of the thumbnails that we're going to be filling out. You can just make a whole bunch of them, practice drawing your rectangles, and then you can begin to sketch inside of them once you have enough. All right, so this part is basically where we just speed run through a lot of ideas. Now, you can just really let yourself play here. This is the playland of the process because you're going to be developing the most exciting part for most artists, and oftentimes that includes myself, and that is the myriad of concepts and ideas that are going to come through for your final illustration. So in this first one, I have one of my original characters in a kind of a heightened position looking down at the street and looking at his phone. So it's sort of like a surveillance type thing in a, kind of futuristic, semi-modern setting. And it was just really fun to sketch out. Next, we have a female figure, again, from the same project, which I kind of think in terms of as my personal art goes. I like to work with the same characters, the same settings, because it just gives me sort of a comfort zone to go back to, even though I can push things compositionally as far as the different themes and illustrative principles go. Just it helps develop the story a little bit more if I feel like I know the characters and can work through their journeys and moments that way. So in this case, we have another one of my characters, and she is not doing well. She's actually in some sort of medical facility, waking up kind of in a groggy way, and she's seated in the bed, and she's looking at the different intubations and different kind of scars and bandages of what must have been a battle that could have gone better. So I'm just adding some little nodes and medical device ideas so that I can return to them later if I do decide to use that thumb. It's also in the square composition, so I thought that was just a fun canvas to work with. Next, this one was basically going to be two of those characters running forward. It was either going to be away from something or towards something, but I ended up removing one of the characters and going in a different direction with it. It just wasn't vibing compositionally, and it felt a little cloistered. So instead, I decided to just stick with one character and just have him kind of leaning diagonally, which is uncomfortable because he looks like he's falling. And maybe at this point in the story, he would be. It's just that moment where maybe you utilized a flourish or power too much and you're on the verge of passing out, or you're entering a weird fever dream state. There's a lot that could be going on with that idea. Next, we have another character doing surveillance again, sort of looking out into this really grubby area where three other figures are standing, just kind of finding cover and peeking out from the side, adding a nice vertical foreground element there to show that we kind of want to frame the action of what that character is looking at. And next we have another sketch where I'm basically just drawing out the other main character again, and he is going to be holding the hand of the girl who we see in the panel that she's injured in that one. So this could be a moment perhaps right before she gets injured. It could be after she she was hurt, but they look like they're having some sort of disagreement, like they're not on the same page. And you'll see that here in a second, because even though these look like they're going by quickly, it's because they are. I basically time-lapsed them. So this is a mid shot of the characters just sort of having a disagreement. He's leaning uncomfortably outside of the picture plane. They're not centered. So that says something right there. And I was taking away the opacity of the brush so that I could work a little more heavy, a little more inky, as opposed to some of the pencil-y kind of sketches. Sometimes it helps to think differently if you switch your settings a little bit. So this is just both of those figures just not on the same page, despite holding hands for whatever reason, maybe trying to lead each other in different directions. But when it's like the question is, will they reconcile it? What's going on? And that one, I don't have any background context, so that's something to keep in mind. If I select this one going forward, then I will have to work all of that out to add more story. But for now, it's very character driven. And then the actual last sketch is mostly a background sketch. I started with the background this time as opposed to a character, just so you can see what that looks like. And it's sort of a tech alley kind of setting. So you can see I'm just laying in the ground plane, the midground, and the background. And eventually we'd start working our way towards a foreground, but really I want to just get some figures in there for scale. And that pretty much showcases the thumbnailing process. All right, since we've now created some thumbnails, it's time to choose the best one. And in this case, I'm feeling like the first one I did is the best. Now, you might think differently or see different things in some of these, in which case I would invite you to start thumbnailing and maybe take a break from this series just so you can get your own foundations down, because next we're going to be grabbing reference and cementing those foundations. So I'm going to take this guy and I'm going to walk you through how you can pick out each element and get reference and start to think of the foundation you're going to use to have a successful illustration. Okay, so we've gone and gathered our reference from mostly Pinterest and Google, and then one from ArtStation by the wonderful artist Christina Lavinia from Respawn Entertainment. She's fantastic. Check out her work. But basically what I did is I cross-referenced my thumbnail to many different images that are going to help me fill out all of the compositional elements. So as you can see, we have really interesting views of cityscapes and grids, parkour people doing very dangerous things that you should never attempt in any way, shape, or form, and somebody chilling with some coffee, which is a lot more safe, and you should probably just do that. At any rate, this image right here has all of the elements basically laid out for me, and each of these elements that I'm seeing in these images is going to help me to fill in all of the detail that I need to. Is this everything I need in order to finish the image in a really strong way? Well, the only way to find that out is to go through the process. Somehow, I feel like we are going to need to pull in some additional imagery, but you never know. Let's get started on establishing our foundation. All right, so the first steps are pretty important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File, New in Photoshop. I'm going to go to the Print tab, and I'm going to select A4 because it is a standard print size. I'm going to use the resolution of 500 just because I like a little more room for detail if necessary. After that, I'm going to grab my thumbnail and drop it in to that new document, after which I will scale it up appropriately so that I do not see the borders anymore. And I'm not mad at the head getting cut off a little bit, but we still need to make sure that our composition is going to be befitting at this stage. So it's best to zoom out and make sure that if you need to, you can just fill in the details elsewhere. So that looks good for now. Some side borders might actually be an interesting element, kind of like how Alphonse Mucha handled it. So that will work for now. I'm going to then drop the opacity down and begin a second drawing. Now this second drawing, I'm going to enlist the help of those references by going to Window, Arrange, and Tile 2 Up Vertical. you can see that my references are now available to me, and since this one is the closest to my pose, I'm just going to utilize that. So I'm going to zoom in, and we're going to get to drawing. Hello and welcome as we proceed with laying down the foundation. So this portion is basically going to revolve around being able to create a basis that allows us to bring our illustration to a decent level of finish. And in that sense, what I usually like to do is to refine the drawing. Oftentimes the basis is going to be very drawing heavy, and that is just sort of par for the course. If you get really, really good at working with large abstract shapes, you can also lay down your basis that way. You will have to refine those shapes quite a bit throughout your process, but that is sort of outside the scope of this type of illustration tutorial, which is more drawing heavy, more based on those linear principles we talked about earlier in the particular course. So we're pretty much sticking with that. And in that sense, it's as simple as lowering the opacity on the drawing and then doing another drawing over it. Now, this first drawing, I wasn't completely in love with for a number of reasons, and I will get into that a little bit later, but you'll see me, as sort of a spoiler alert here, just completely redo it. Basically, the first drawing is a good practice run, and sometimes it turns out great, and you don't need to mess with it. But since the main focal point is the character here, I really wanted it to be a more solid drawing than this, and I kind of went way off model of my sketch, which if I was in a client-based scenario, they usually don't take too kindly to that. So what I ended up doing is going back and making it much more true to the initial sketch as far as the drawing foundation is concerned. And it just makes it more authentic to what you were trying to do initially, and not being too willing to deviate super far from that, because there's a reason why you chose that initial thumbnail for the impact that it had. And so you don't want to lose that impact as you lay your foundation. That's one of the key things I wish to convey to you. Whenever you're scaling something up and you really like the energy of it, you have to be careful to enhance whatever you love about it as you are kind of working. You have to be careful to bring the best parts of it forward and leave the stuff that you don't need behind. You want to amplify the elements that are really working, and the stuff that doesn't work so well, you'll figure it out and you can play it down or just do away with it entirely. And a lot of that will happen in this drawing process. As you can see, I start from the head and just begin working my way downward. You know, looking at it at this point, it wasn't bad. For some reason, I got kind of a weird offshoot of DBZ or Dragon Ball Z vibes from the style, which I wasn't hating, but it wasn't really what I was going for. And so I think that if I would have just kept going with this sketch, it would have been fine. But as you'll see, I just get way off track as we proceed with the time-lapse demonstration here. And it was pretty much just a matter of self-correcting and having the courage to let go of that version, because I didn't lose it in a sense. I really just practiced that pose, and I took a couple wrong turns on the route to where I'm heading, but it doesn't mean I'll never get there. And oftentimes when an artist gets lost, even a little bit during the process, they just sort of sit down and abandon the piece and head back home. But the destination still exists. Just because you didn't find it doesn't mean that it's not out there somewhere. And it may not be the way that you wanted to get there or the way that you thought you would get there, but you have to be flexible in that regard. So I always try to do that. I always try to get rid of something if it's not working. And in this case, it was working all right, and I could have kept going, but it just wasn't vibing properly. So we sort of let it go. In terms of what I'm doing with the line work, you'll see that I'm really just sticking to those larger shapes, you know, the shape of the head, large shape of a hood that frames the head, the shoulder girdle, modified cylinders for the arms that have a little bit of movement and overlap within those cylinders to create the illusion of a jacket, which I'm referencing very heavily from the picture on the right. And you'll see that I also brought in some more reference, one being a previous, more polished illustration of mine of the same character in a different scenario and in a different format. It's much more of a poster as opposed to this, which is more of a narrative illustration. It's more of a moment in time. It's not just about putting a bunch of elements that are included in the story overall in sort of an abstract way, which titles and covers often do. And it's really more about creating a feeling based on an actual moment, and everything as far as what's included on the picture plane is related to that moment. So it's really more narrative driven. It's more about illustrating what's going on at this particular instance. It's not about getting a cast of characters together in this sort of very, there's a word for it, in a very non-candid way. Because when something is candid, it's very natural, it's very authentic, and you feel the feelings of the moment in a certain sense, all the things that are going on, and nobody's posing for the camera, nobody is a model in that regard. It's what you don't want to see from actors on stage, because if you don't capture things candidly, then we have a hard time suspending our disbelief. And there's a moment not to do that, like for marketing art or covers, or to get somebody's attention for a different reason. But in this case, that wasn't what I was going for. Another element to this is that, again, I deviated way too far in terms of what I was doing with his pose. I tried to show more of the legs, and I didn't work on any studies from this particular perspective and drawing angle. So I just knew that it wasn't going to work out the way that I wanted drawing-wise. And I would probably need to take some more reference myself, because I was having trouble finding anything that would fit that pose perfectly, and it's not one that I'm super great at drawing. I was also kind of struggling with the proportions of the head to hair ratio. And again, all of this is stuff you want to work on in the drawing phase. You really don't want to be messing with this stuff once you have shapes and fills in your painting or your cell shading or whatever, because then the complexity is magnified. Everything has a relationship to one another, and the relationship is not only in the layers menu, but it's on the picture plane. And then you have to move many pieces. It's like filling a house up too quickly and then having to move. You want to get all your basics in there first, and then you can start to lay them in with confidence, bring in the additional stuff. So we do that all in the drawing phase, in the laying the foundation phase. So here's me just checking both of them, not being impressed, and not really vibing on it. I suppose looking back at it now during the recording, I don't hate it as much as I did in the moment, but it still deviated way too much from the thumbnail. And I can always save a different iteration of the file and try something else with it later if I really liked the work or felt like it had potential, which it's more of a peaceful look. It's more of he's just sort of chilling on the edge of a building for whatever reason and feeling himself. I would probably put maybe headphones in his ears or something. And I think that would be a different illustration. But for this one, for the purposes of sticking with what we've established, I decided to start over. But it's really okay, because like I said, the practice isn't wasted. For one, I can still leverage that digital data that's embedded within the file and repurpose it and make a whole nother illustration later using some of those assets as a basis, or just continue refining them. And for two, I actually got to give it a bit of a test run, find out a couple paths that don't work as well. And that's just part of art. That's just something you're going to have to feel out in the process, which is why we include the process in full, even though it's not real time. It's pretty much everything I'm doing on the canvas, and I don't want you to be occluded from that. Because oftentimes, especially when you're just starting out, you're in the midst of the process and you feel very, very confused. You feel very lost. You feel very like, am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? Where should I be going? What should I be focusing on at this point? And the broad answer to some of those questions is you basically have to just trust yourself and trust your intuition as you proceed, which will sharpen through time. You know what you like, you know what you don't like, and if you're being honest with yourself, you know what's not looking good and what's not working. And you just have to for one, trust yourself, but also be honest with yourself in that regard. Because if you don't, then the work's going to suffer. And it's not the work's fault, but it doesn't mean go ahead and blame yourself and create a whole nother myriad of problems. It just means that you have to develop a lot of soft skills that aren't talked about as much when you're learning some of the technical stuff, because there's technique, but there's also mindsets. And so I want to convey some of that stuff as well, because it's going to aid you ultimately on your journey to create images that have more of a cohesive semblance of where you'd like to go. And so there was me checking the new drawing against the old drawing, liking it a lot more, feeling a lot more solid about it. It has the emotion I'm going for, which is a pensiveness. He's on the edge. He's balancing. He's sort of braced and ready in case danger comes his way, or in case he has to leap into action or do something. And with no context, this seems crazy. Like, why would somebody be at the edge of a building? And what would they leap into action for? There's a lot of questions, and we want some of those questions. They're not hard questions necessarily. Some illustrations are designed to get people asking hard questions, which is important as well. However, this one, again, is just more narrative driven. It's not so much about inquiring on deeper, more philosophical levels. It's just more of a what's going on. I want to know what's going to happen next, because this is a moment in time where clearly something is not right. And somebody is overseeing it, and we're on a journey with them as they try to figure out what are the next moves. He's holding his cell phone in his hand, so he's probably in correspondence with people, and it's just nice to have all those little bits and pieces starting to come together from the character outward. So at this point, we're again just really refining that character, really focusing on our figure and getting everything as right as we can at this point. A lot of this is zooming in after we establish the large scale shapes and working more assiduously on the face. The face needs to come out really decently, otherwise the whole thing is going to be dragged down significantly in quality. So as we proceed, we'll continue to always keep working the face into better proportions, better shape design, better expression. Is it conveying what we want? What is the character thinking? How is that reflected on his countenance? So all of those things are things to consider when you're illustrating. So a lot of it is just the trial and error game, the try different versions of different eyes, different sets of proportions, different mouths. It's a mix and match kind of game, and that's just sort of the draw, erase, retry game. Imagine yourself creating a custom character in a specific pose for your illustration, like if you were to be playing a video game, and the character is in the specific pose already. You have the pose established, you like that, but you keep scrolling through different mouths and different eyes and different proportions for the face. That is something that you really have the option to do as an artist. Once you're able to comfortably draw different eyes, nose, mouths, all of those things, you'll be able to then get a lot more freedom. You'll gain the freedom to be able to draw a lot of different options and varieties until you land on the ones that are working together, that are synchronizing. However, since the figure was looking decent, and I was pleased with all those things after trying several iterations, it was then time to start building the background out. And that's where we get into our friends, the lines. The lines, I'm using the line tool in Photoshop. It's as though I have a built-in ruler to be able to establish all of these different linear elements and to close off areas of the picture plane into shapes that are more manageable. What I just did there was I sort of did a really quick perspective point and began to utilize that in order to create a better sense of depth. So perspective is something I teach more in depth in the beginner drawing course. If you wanted to know more about anatomy of characters, how bodies work to an artist in sort of a simplified format, I also have simple anatomy for artists. So those are things that are not in the Artist Ascent program. However, they are available at thebeginnerdrawingcourse.com in case you want to shore up your fundamentals in those regards, because they will help you on your illustrative journey ultimately. That I can guarantee you. So basically after we get all of those different shapes established on the picture plane, I'm just blocking them out. It's basically just a series of cubes. You break it down into cubes, or like a little triangle in the corner there. It's cubes and triangles on the picture plane in order to subdivide and make and assign different value scales to them. Or not value scales, but different values, because we're ultimately unifying it all on one value scale, which we'll talk more about later. However, at this point I am laying in the values, meaning that I'm separating the different elements out based on lightness and darkness. That's why I keep grayscaling it. I keep grayscaling the image and tweaking the values to make sure that each one reads separately and has its own pattern that is strong enough that even if I were to take the lines away, things would still read, even though the lines are the scaffolding of this image, which is why we talk about lines and fills and shapes. I'm now using shadow shapes, wherein I'm creating the shapes of the shadows on the character in an effort to give some form and dimension, because everything is fairly flat right now. It's just a graphic block in. And we do this because it's very simple. We want things to remain as simple as possible so that we can just say, okay, well, I just need to turn the values down for my next phase because then I'll work in shadow. Usually you can work somewhere in the mid-tones, because that way you have room to make things lighter or darker. So when it comes to working with your values, again, I talk a ton about that in the beginner drawing course or the beginner painting course, or the Art Maxian bundle, all available on the beginnerdrawingcourse.com. But in short, the values are really, really integral for adding new shapes, breaking up the shapes of the character, having patterns that are accessible to you to read, so that you know that these are the shadow shapes, these are the mid-tone shapes, these are the light shapes, and using those different delineations of value, you're able to then create a clearer read and start to, forge a lighting scenario. And that's kind of what I'm doing here. I'm using a big soft brush to really kind of push the brightness of the pavement up into the building and sort of fog out some of the areas of the building that aren't as important. I don't typically stick with these. It's just a good way of reminding me what's important on the picture plane and what is less important. So some of the background elements, and it's also a way of reminding me of the ambiance in certain areas where light is blooming or sort of bleeding out. But after I've established that, it's pretty much time to start pushing some different colors into the character. And the colors I'm using are very simple. It's a variant on his jacket. It's more of a whitish grayish version of it, and the pants, which you can't see in the illustration that I did prior, those are pretty much the same for the character design. Again, I wasn't designing the character on the fly. I've had this character for a number of years, so I can focus on other elements, because character design is a whole beast in and of itself, and we will be covering it in the Artist Ascent Academy and in the character drawing course, which I have on the beginnerdrawingcourse.com. We talk about design as well for your characters, so that's something that you can check out if you're interested in character design specifically and how to draw characters and not so much focus on backgrounds or illustrations, which is what we're sort of bringing all those things to bear here. What I'm doing next, after I've laid in some simple separations of color using a hard light layer, is I just start painting on top of everything so I can keep playing with colors a little bit more, keep playing with shadows a little bit more. You see, I don't push things all the way through in terms of shadow because I want room to go down deeper, and I want room to continue to refine the volumes of the character. And so that's basically what I'm doing, is just really putting that good time in on the character, because he's the thing that we're going to be connecting with in this image. His face, his pose, his read has to be on point. And I haven't put the glasses on yet because those are something I can always add later, which we do. So the rest of it is just about kind of getting a little hair out of the way so we can read the face better. I zoom out and rotate the canvas frequently to check how the big picture is reading, how the shapes are reading. Even if I turn them 90 degrees, do they still look right? Do they still feel right? I often turn the canvas upside down as well to check this, and I will flip the values to grayscale, because that also helps to check if things are reading. If it separates in grayscale, it'll separate fine with color. However, color is really not the focus of this image. It's just something that I'm putting in because we don't want to work on a grayscale image. It might have been a good idea because it's Illustration 101, but we do a lot of grayscale in the beginner drawing course, and we'll have grayscale challenges later in the Artist Ascent Drawing Development Academy. So it doesn't really matter as much. If you're interested in those things, of course, you can always check those out. But for this, the color is sort of an afterthought. We're not going to be talking too much about that. It's really about establishing the composition and the full process of the illustration, which is why it's Illustration 101. So we started with our thumbnail, we laid in our foundations of line, and once everything was separated and had more of a clear direction, that's when we can then begin to lay in our fills and our shapes and start thinking about values. So we think about lines, then we think about our values and the value patterns, and then we can start to work on our characters and our focal points some more, because that's going to need to be pretty prime moving forward. And you see I'm looking at that great art by Christina Lavinia. Again, check her out on ArtStation. It's just helpful to know what other artists have done and how they sort of leverage values and stuff. There's not a lot of line work at all in her piece, which is helpful because it lets me see what kind of forms I would like to use and how to paint a darker skinned character. And at this point in the process, since the character is looking relatively polished and the background is still in its raw foundational state, it becomes time to start working on the background. The simple fact is that pretty much everything on the picture plane will have the work of our hands applied to it at a certain point in the process. And so what I was pretty much going for is now I need to get this polished character in the proper spot to begin giving the background some love. And at first, you have the tendency to get overwhelmed, like there's a lot of background and there was only a little bit of character. And maybe you've done more characters than you have backgrounds, but that's why you're in Illustration 101, baby. So it's going to be all right. You're going to be fine. Basically, you just break the background up into shapes the same way you would break a character into shapes. I'm doing this in grayscale, but you don't have to if you're confident in your ability to still see the value patterns. So what I'm then doing is just using the polygonal lasso tool to work with those geometric foundational, very basic shapes. It's just a long rectangle in perspective. That's all that it is. And for the top shape, it's pretty much another rectangle with a small trapezoid extruding onto the side of it. So that is pretty much the little wedge that I put the character out on because it's good for the composition. And architecturally, maybe they were doing something different with this building. It was at that point I then switched over to working on the street a little bit after laying in the wall of the building and how it relates to that edge that he finds himself on. That edge is inspired by all those edges in the reference image to the right as well. So it was just a nice little touch. As far as the background goes, it's really, again, just a bunch of basic shapes and lines. Everything is shapes and lines. And when you can learn to turn them and abstract them into those things, you'll have a much easier time tackling the process. Because you will be able to kind of make it more manageable. So what I did was once they were already grayscale, I then used the hue saturation tool to colorize them and give them a base color to work with, because I knew that I was going to not have them stay grayscale if the character's in color. And again, this is a color illustration, so you just use that particular filter. But then I use adjustment rather, excuse me. And then you use the line tool to just keep on adding lines to the background to emphasize the perspective. Again, it's like as though I have a ruler that is just handy and ready for me inside of the program. The rest of the process is just breaking that background down into those basic shapes. A lot of rectangles, as you can see. So many things fit into cubes, it is ridiculous. And if you really master your cubes, you will have a much easier time relating them to one another and even modifying them or creating more complicated cubes, which is essentially what cars and freeway overpasses and buildings are, is just cubes with subdivisions and more lines and modifications, and then just place them in perspective. We're just breaking everything down here. The next thing I started to do was get a line of greenery in there because it's in the reference image, and I'm like, that looks pretty nice in there. It's a nice big green shape that's a little more irregular. So you see I'm not using the polygonal lasso for that shape. I am just breaking it in with the default round brush because it's more of a by hand thing than a let the program kind of work it thing. So every shape is just something you have to pay attention to and know how to create the edges of it, know how to create the general large shape of it, know how to break it up with your brush strokes and your marks and your hand to get the effect you're looking for. So that's essentially what I'm doing here, is just using that greenery to subdivide that whole ground plane. The foreground in this case is where the character is residing. The midground is the building cascading down. And the background is actually the city level, the level of the city, the ground. So the background is the ground of the foundation. And that is sort of an interesting way of parsing it, because typically, you're going to be seeing from a different perspective. But in this particular image, that's how the foreground, middle ground, background kind of shook out. So I'm just changing the angle of the image so I can work my hand a little bit differently. And that's helpful in a lot of ways because you'll also be able to see how the shape is looking. I always recommend flipping the canvas a lot. That's something I learned in art school from a person I sat next to. She was flipping her sketchbook all these ways, and I was like, why are you doing that? And she's like, oh, I just want to see what the drawing looks like from a bunch of different areas. I'm like, that's cool. And I didn't start doing it until about a year later. And I noticed, if something's not really holding up at a 90-degree angle, or if the image is turned 90 degrees and it's not working, then I have some more work to do. I have to change and augment the shape or the relationship of things so that they do start working better. It's also a good way to see if the image is actually getting the effect you want. For example, for him to look like he's high up. The perspective is definitely forced on this one. I didn't calculate it out properly. Admittedly, it's just sort of a stack of different shapes that give you the illusion, but I don't have vanishing points and horizon lines and 3-point perspective for this one. It was just something I wanted to exercise pretty quickly, and it's actually better in the laying the foundation stage if you are going to use perspective. What I have been doing a lot of, though, is perspective practices outside of illustration. So I have a whole myriad of perspective demonstrations in 2-point and in 1-point and a couple in 3-point that will kind of give more context to what I'm doing, and I will upload those to the Artist Ascent Academy eventually in one of the months here if there's enough demand for it. But I have all of those recorded and ready to go. Once you've done enough perspective drills, you don't need to be as assiduous with it. It is still better to do it. I do recommend it. I don't recommend you copy this modality if you're tackling an image like this. There are some perspective issues that I will have to kind of still iron out before I wrap this one up, but it's just about the ones you can live with and the ones that you can't at this point. So we'll tackle that later, and maybe I will set up a grid and play around a little bit just to show you how to do that. But for now, I'm just going in and painting those little car shapes, and you see I've zoomed into the reference so that I can take a look at the little car shapes and just genuinely, vaguely approximate them. It's really just no more than a couple brush strokes because they're so far away. To the viewer, they're in the background, we wouldn't really be able to make out much of those. And so that's how it should feel. They're not as important, so I'm not putting a lot of time into them. You really want to place all your time at your focal point, and everything else is just context. Everything else should sort of fall off because that's how we naturally see. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. What you see me doing next is basically I worked a little bit on some of those bridges that again are in the reference, kind of shooting out of the building that go across the freeway of the city. And I think that they were just really nice compositional elements that lead you back into the building. Other than that, it's just about a little more work on that building, placing some low contrast lines, using the line tool, and painting a little bit where applicable, just quickly touching up some of those areas. Because there's some stark little dots that I put on the edge of the building for whatever reason, which aren't on the reference, so I just start kind of doing away with them. Other than that, it's just about creating little lines in the road, just making a small scale series of shapes, because we have all of our big shapes established. So when we pick little areas to work on the smaller ones, that's always helpful, kind of denoting the sidewalk a little bit as opposed to the street, just because again, we have all these different shape areas of the picture plane. You have the background, which is all the stuff on the actual ground. You have the midground, which is the building leading all the way back up, and then the foreground, which is the top of the building and sort of housing the character in that exterior indent. So, I mean, that actually makes a ton of sense, exterior indent. What I meant to say is the extrusion. So then I just kind of placed some some diagonal lines running across the building, because it helps to add a little bit of detail. Some of them can be seen in other buildings in the reference. And I was really just trying to pick and choose what I wanted from the reference, because I knew it would be helpful in terms of gathering just some more believability into the image. It's not quite at the what's missing point, but we're getting there. So once we start to grab some of the nice little ideas in the background, like you can see that quite a bit of the street is reflected in the building. And that's something that I just sort of inferred very lightly. It's one of those nice little details and touches that you can include, because we have everything established in at least its roughest state now. So it's good to just keep on refining all of it, including some of those interesting grates that are in the back of this particular building. So you basically just look at those shapes and approximate what they might be in your work. And the color was really kind of off and distracting. It's very, very grungy, very like burnt orange. And so I needed to change that, but it's nice to be able to establish all the initial shapes before doing so. So that's basically what I'm doing, is just subdividing the larger shapes that I've already created with medium-sized shapes, and then smaller shapes within those medium shapes. And that's how we organize our picture plane. We're taking the biggest shapes and the most important stuff and getting that down first, after which we're switching to the medium stuff and then subdividing that medium stuff even further. So subdivision is a huge idea in 3D modeling, and I think it applies very well to painting as well, because it helps us manage the quote-unquote topology of our image. So that's something to really keep in mind when it comes to managing your shapes. But you see I'm just adding more details to the midground of the building, making sure that that looks all right, popping back and forth between the foreground and the middle ground and the background, because the character's gotten a lot of love, and so everything surrounding the character needs to get a degree of love as well. But now we're sort of at the what's missing point. And the what's missing point was some more danger. We had that smoke trail that we added on our initial lecture with the ship, with the crashed spaceship. Well, now there's another problem on the ground, and it requires yet another smoke trail. It's a nice little way to add some more urgency to an image. It's a nice effect. And the smoke trail is serpentine. You know, it's shaped in very S-like ways, like the letter S. So it's got a curve to it. Everything else was very straight, very linear. The building, the elements of the building, the ground, everything was very straight and rectangular or linear. And so it's good to have a wavy element to break that all up. You have your, very straight lines, your verticals, your horizontals, your diagonals. Then you have your curved lines. And in this case, we needed a nice big curve. It was the what's missing. It was also the action, or the sense of urgency that we were missing before. That starts to come into play now. So it adds even more of a narrative verve to our image. And because you can see I'm adding fire, and I brought in a fire image so that I can look at what that's like, how to get it looking hot, how to get the smoke looking right, all those soft edges. So there was quite a bit to draw from in terms of that reference. And I wouldn't have been able to capture it as quickly as I did had I not used the reference. Of course, you can always spend time for a very long time refining all the different elements of your picture plane. But again, you have to know how to work smart and to focus on what you're going to spend the most time on, because it's the most important to the image, the most important to the viewer, most important to the narrative, and everything else is kind of secondary. So that is always something to keep in mind. I did use a smoke brush from Grigor Rutkowski's brush pack. It's something that I unfortunately cannot give you because I paid for it and it is not mine to give. So you can look him up as 88GRZ in Google, and his name should come up as an artist, and you can find his stuff on Cube Brush or ArtStation. You can buy the brush pack. So other than that, it was really helpful for helping me get that effect down so that I could proceed with the rest of the image. And now that the background looks solid and there's a lot of context and the character looks like he's sort of vibing with the background, I figure it's safe to put more time into the focal point, which is the character. So I'm just going in, deepening some of the dark areas with more shadow and occlusion. I am kind of pushing the silhouette around a little bit, you'll see, and I'm also adding details like the fingers on the ground and inferring a little shadow and cleaning up again the silhouette. So all of that is really good for our focal point. It makes it read more clearly, just works a lot nicer. So I'm making sure that the sort of fashion lines in the pants are coming through, and it's good to help to demarcate where the knees are, adding shadow under the neck, and just genuinely going in and thinking about how I can make the character look better or pop a little bit more or have a little more intrigue to him. And it's nice because, again, the reference is right there. That's the beautiful thing about illustration and concept art and picture making in general is reference. I used to be very resistant to it. I was like, is it cheating? But it's never cheating. There's professional artists that are at the top of their game that trace sometimes. It's just about creating a really good image and using all of these fundamental principles to design it well and as best you can, really. So that's what you keep in mind, and the rest of it is just technique. It's how to get there, and sometimes you can take a couple shortcuts. They're not great for developing your abilities, but they're good for getting a final result. So it's a cost-benefit analysis either way. Basically, it just comes down to getting that character looking even more solid, adding some more context, and then we're just going to get into our finishing touches and effects points soon after this, once the character is looking more solid and some of those elements are really reading and resonating nicely. So that's basically what we're just doing at this point. It's adding those little details because all the big stuff's really in place, all the medium stuff's in place, so got to start adding things like a shadow to make them feel grounded. And you can see the shadow in the reference image to the right with the girl standing on top of the building, popping things a little bit more with a touches of value contrast. And that's just kind of the game. There's not really much to say about that. It's really just refining the little things. Okay, so we're at a good point right now to kind of stop and reflect. We've got every element essentially blocked in. We've got some refinement of elements, and it's just good to look at our list and make sure that we are on track. So knowing where we're going, we had a pretty good idea of that from the thumbnail. We were working smart because we've gotten this far in approximately 2.5 working hours doing the work. That is essentially what we did to get to this point, but there is still more work to do, which we are still doing, so check that off. When disaster strikes. So we could look at this a couple different ways. This is something that I'm grabbing from Mr. Pressfield, whose first name escapes me. I always mix him up with Scott Robertson, but I think it's Stephen Pressfield. So Stephen Pressfield has a phenomenal series of books, The War of Art and Resistance and Do the Work. Just a lot of really good books that will help you to create at higher and higher levels. And for me, I find that disaster striking usually means that either I lose the file or there is some fatal flaw in the image that threatens to destroy it. But in all sincerity, this one's coming together pretty reasonably. I think the biggest issue that I see right now is in his amount of contrast versus everything else, as in there's all these different value patterns and nothing else really got that treatment. So we need to sort of find a way to harmonize him with the background. And then you also have this perspective issue regarding the building and this sort of odd transition here of shape and form, which we can iron out by using a perspective grid. So I would kind of call those disaster striking because I really don't want to do them, to be honest. If I'm talking about my feeling, like the feeling that comes up in me is like, yeah, I made it this far, I don't want to fix it, blah 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 blah. But we're gonna do it just because it's illustration 101, and you got to show off some good habits. So let's count those as disaster striking, because mostly the perspective grid, because that may require quite a bit of adjustment once we get through that portion. Bringing it home is essentially what we're trying to do right now. And the final check of what's missing, we already did that with the curvilinear line of smoke, but I think there's also some scale missing here. Like, it almost feels as though there should be like a small bird in the background or something of that nature to let you know that he's not gigantic, because the scale isn't like super evident. So even if there's just like some like little pigeon or just some other element around this character to let us know, like, no, he's really not huge. There's other things around him to give us that sense of scale. So just doodle in a little bird there. But if it's more than one bird, we know that it's not his bird, because they're just kind of chilling on the roof. So we'll have to find reference for those guys, because I don't draw birds often enough to have them committed to memory. But I can still lay in the general shape of where they might be. And they could be looking at him or kind of pecking around, just to kind of add a little city ambience, you know. But yeah, we'll just have some little bird shapes. We'll have one kind of behind him that's doing its own thing, probably pecking the ground or something, tail up, so you know it's a bird. So that'll kind of work for now. Zoom out to double check. Yeah, those aren't really that bothersome, and they keep the focus on him. So we'll see if those work for the final. As far as effects 101, the smoke was kind of already in effect, but I'm going to use some lighting effects to wrap this up that we'll talk about, adding that extra pop. We will do that again with some of the lighting effects and some little color notes here and there to sort of give that a little more weight. And then we'll wrap everything up, summarize, and export the image. So if that sounds good, then maybe take a little break at this point if you haven't already. Get yourself a beverage of choice and maybe a snack, and we'll just keep plowing through. And at the very end, I will summarize and give you your own assignment so that you too can work on your illustration 101 skills. Okay, hopefully at this point you've taken your little break or your long break or what have you. And now we're going to return to starting to troubleshoot some of the things that hadn't been resolved earlier in the process, which is fine. I wouldn't exactly call it disaster striking, like a file crash or something of that nature. Obviously, the longer you work on a project or the more involved and complicated the project is, the greater the chance that something big will come and try to clear the playing field. But you just have to know how to work around that stuff. But in this case, we do have some things to resolve, and some of it is perspective-based, and some of it is just in terms of compositional elements not really telling the story as effectively as they could. So what you're seeing me do on the references is taking and just kind of using line to figure out what are some of the angles that the buildings are facing, and how can I replicate those angles. And that's essentially what I'm doing here. A whole new perspective grid in 3-point perspective, having not done one initially, would be a little too arduous of a task for an illustration of this magnitude. So I figure if I can just find ways to align the angles and get it to look more believable, then I'll be in decent enough shape for this one. So that's basically what I did with the references. I was just using the lines to discover the relationships between the various geometries. And I figure that if I take and replicate the largest extrusion, then I can create more believability, kind of like how the facade of that girl standing on top of that particular building has those extrusions coming out. So that's basically the idea. Here I am playing with the positioning of some of the other ones, just to see if I can get a more interesting composition, because we didn't have every single thing figured out in the thumbnail. And so I'm grayscaling and trying to darken the element, seeing if I can bring a little more foreground action. And spoiler alert, if you've seen the final image, this doesn't make it into it, because no matter how I scaled it like that, it just didn't work. So what I ended up doing was kind of closing off the back opening to the composition, because as I rotated the canvas, that's the part that stuck out the most to me as really betraying a lot of the scale and perspective. And so it was just a matter of troubleshooting and taking that component, moving it around until I turned it into a back wall. And then it feels like the building is even taller and he's not at the apex of it. So it does automatically add more verisimilitude to the perspective, which is just a fancy word for making it more believable. After which there was definitely some conflicts to take care of, like that line creating quite a bit of an improper kind of collision between the lines of the building and the lines of the extrusion on the building. So much of this is paying attention to where lines converge or how they interact with one another. It's like building a symphony. You have to have all of the instruments arranged in such a way that they're not really clashing. And when it comes to hard surface work, meaning anything that is not organic, like an animal or a person, like instead we're talking vehicles, robots, buildings, man-made things typically. The name of the game is to really just pay attention to those lines and to make sure that if it's not going to be perfectly aligned in perspective, then it should at least be believable insofar as you're able to make sure that lines are converging in ways that don't fight each other, in ways that augment the feeling of space, which is largely what I did by drawing on those references, was to get a feel for that. And once I had that feeling, I was able to replicate it easier in my own canvas. After which, I'm just using a multiply layer. This is where we start to get into some effects. I'm switching to a color dodge layer now and giving my character Isaac an aura, because the universe in which he comes from, Satellite Psychic Saga, is largely based on a game called Phantom Dust, which was a cult hit for the Xbox. Now, I'm not talking Xbox One or Xbox 360 or Xbox X or whatever the heck it's called now. I honestly don't keep up with games. I have too much drawing to do. But it was on Xbox, and a lot of people played it, but it wasn't really well received in terms of the larger, more mainstream audience, but it was still a phenomenal game based on psychic powers, and it inspired me very deeply to work on my own project that had some of those similar elements and themes. So basically I'm using color dodge as a layer beneath Isaac. What I do is I create a pure black layer, and then color dodge, the way that the layer mode works in terms of the blend mode, is you can pick out various areas getting closer and closer to white in terms of your value structure to have some glow. So that's what I'm doing. And I'm also using various brushes, the soft brush and the chalk brush, to kind of push and pull at that aura by also smudging a bit as well with the smudge tool. So you can see there's a lot of different steps to that effect. It's something you kind of got to play with. I got lucky the first time around and I enjoyed the way that the aura looked. So I really didn't do a whole lot after with it. I just knew I wanted some different particles, some of them floating off, some of them staying on the body. It's almost like a vapor that sort of feels like airy or maybe a bit like plasma. So after that effect was in and I had used the multiply layer, the effects are basically there to help play with the values in a way that augments the work. So one of the ways of doing that is, as I said, the color dodge layer, by applying a pure black fill to it and then using gray to white to sort of draw out light. And then the other way is multiply layers, which are great for adding shadowed areas and for glazing darker values onto your picture plane. So if you haven't really explored blend modes a ton, or you don't understand them very well, it's really good to get a get a kind of feel for them by playing around. Otherwise, you are kind of missing out. And these blend modes exist in Clip Studio Paint, they exist in Photoshop, they exist in Procreate. So there's no reason not to use them to augment your work. As far as these birds go, they were a waste of time. I wanted them there for scale, but I realized that it's just betraying a lot of the dynamism that could be brought to this piece. There are so many diagonals, and there's straight lines and curved lines, which we like to juxtapose against one another. The straight lines, and by straight I don't mean purely strictly horizontal, vertical lines, because those are, obviously 90 degrees from one another, whereas there are pretty much no 90-degree lines on this picture plane. The degrees of lines here are all angles that are not right angles, meaning that it's 3-point perspective. But when it comes to creating more dynamism, it's good to juxtapose lines that are straight angled lines, or in certain cases, horizontal and vertical lines with curved lines. And in terms of having the composition read more dynamic, I really wanted to bring in these birds flying around and to make them blackbirds, because it's just more ominous. It's a different symbology than a bunch of like pigeons pecking around him while he's dealing with, a very tense moment. It was not working. And speaking of things that really aren't working, his cell phone hand, if you zoom out far enough, it just doesn't make any sense. Like if he's corresponding with somebody while he's sort of scouting the area. And visually, right now, it just looks like a little gun. My friend's like, when I showed him this illustration, he said, is he holding a little gun? And we had a nice laugh about it because it looked very off. And I had just laid it in with a couple brush strokes, so I'm not surprised. And the angle of it is not great for showcasing, like, oh, it's a cell phone. So instead, we end up using more of his psychic powers instead of a piece of tech, just to change the pose up and such, so it reads a little bit better. You'll notice I just painted a lot of random bird shapes that are very vague, and then I'll smudge them around because the smudge tool starts to blend the pixels. And these things shouldn't be really sharp. If birds are moving and you take a picture of them, depending on your camera, depending on the settings, let's say you're in Central Park, New York, and somebody runs through a huge gathering of doves, and as they all fly away and you take a picture at that moment, the doves are going to be varying degrees of sharpness or blurriness based on the many aspects of the camera, but the motion is what is going to create a lot of blur in that capture. So I wanted to mimic that effect by blurring some of them out with smudge tools and using the filter Gaussian blur. And I'm also trying to concern myself with the placement of them, because I want to make sure that I'm not just dropping these in later and they're not going to work. I did that with the ones that initially didn't work, the little doves that were standing around for scale and trying to make a case for how large and small things are here. But I can do that with birds, but still have dynamism and angles. But I need to juxtapose those birds in a way that feels like the composition is getting enhanced by them. Because that's the name of the game with illustration, is to enhance the composition. You're bringing more attention to your focal points, less attention away from the things that don't matter as much, and you're aiding the narrative, aiding the idea you're trying to get across. So as I'm moving these birds around the picture plane, I'm always checking, flipping the canvas, rotating the canvas, seeing them as abstract, just dark shapes, to sort of help weigh the image down a little bit. But also to create dynamism because they're all at varying angles. And so the way that they're broken up right now is really nice, because you can draw a lot of different triangles between them, which will help focus your eyes on the main character. Here I am Gaussian blurring one of the birds, just because it doesn't need to be all that in focus. And there was quite a bit of work to do once you lay in another element like this, because you've got to refine that element so that it feels like it's part of the picture plane as well. Another thing I thought about was if they're in a hurried, sort of stressful situation, fight or flight, in this case, flight, the feathers are going to be coming off some of them, and that can add even more dynamism and interest amidst the image, because all of those feathers are going to be falling off of them in various shapes and angles. And that's really what a lot of illustration comes down to, is understanding your angles, understanding your shapes, understanding the values of what it is you're laying down, meaning the relative levels of white and black and gray, and understanding the way that those elements are coming together on the picture plane to frame things. So in this case, we have all those birds that are freaking out, and they lead you right back to that character who is sitting pretty near the rule of thirds on this picture plane. And he is also kind of framed by the smoke element, which breaks up the linear elements of the building by being a more flowing, soft element, whereas the building is more of a rigid, sharp-edged element. And so all of these pictorial elements have their own connotations, and everything is relative because we're always comparing it to what is next to it. So you really have to keep that in mind as you're working on your illustration, because it's really going to affect how things kind of come together as a whole. You can't abstract anything fully because you're creating effects by mixing them all together that are arising anew from the mixture. Another way of saying that is you have to relate everything to every other thing on the picture plane. And you do this by really just having a broad view of it. That's why I'm staying zoomed out so much. It's why I am always flipping the canvas to make sure my eyes stay fresh. And I'm just trying to draw attention back to my focal point, which is ultimately the figure. He is differently shaped than anything else. He has the most detail. He has the most value contrast in terms of white, in terms of black, in terms of gray. And so there's just a lot of things working in that favor. I framed him with the building, the aspect of the building that he is seated upon. And now I have these birds that also help to create dynamism and add tension to the image, but also help to make sure you're going to look at him. You know, the birds can lead you around the picture plane, but ultimately they're blurry and not fully in focus, so your eye doesn't really want to go there. Softer edges tend not to draw our eyes as much. They are very, very hard to focus on. It's like having no glasses on if you have a prescription. For example, if you look at many different types of shadows, they all vary in degree of how soft or harsh they are based on the light source, based on the object, if it's a cast shadow, if it's a form shadow. That's something that we have to understand as well. And I go over these different types of shadows in the beginner drawing course, but basically so much of learning to do art is understanding different terminologies, knowing how to apply those terminologies into the techniques that you develop based on your understanding of them, and then creating full images based on some or as many of those terms as you can work into it, and the style you're working in, and if those terms are relevant to it or not. Form shadows and cast shadows typically are something we will consider every single time we're painting, every single time we are having lots of shapes that are filled. But when it comes to line work, there's different ways of communicating cast shadows versus form shadows. What I'm doing now is adding even more refinement to my focal point, because that is pretty integral. I know that there's lots of areas that need to be touched up, and I'm working upside down, which might seem disorienting, but it's because I want to look at the brushstrokes and the character in a more abstract way, because I want to make sure that the brushstrokes themselves are making enough sense. I'm not going to render this one to death. I'm not going to spend 20 hours on it, namely because I have deadlines to hit in terms of the Art Assistant Academy and getting people their assignments and making sure that everybody has the deliverable. So that's just part of being professional. But the other aspect is that I still want to make sure that everything is aligned in terms of the edges of the figure, of the paint job. So a lot of the painting is still very rough as you zoom into the figure, as you zoom into them. So what that looks like in terms of cleaning it up is rotating the canvas around a lot, flipping the canvas a lot, looking at all those different edges of the brush strokes and where they're meeting, and all the different parts that are either covered in line work a little bit still or just need touching up. Your eye will find these areas that are just not reading or resonating properly. I talk about the resonance of an image in terms of its holistic picture quality based on everything you've established, and it's like the full read. If you zoom out and look at the entire image and you squint your eyes, everything will sort of blur to a degree, and you'll be able to get this very light resonance, because your eyes are not fully unfocused and they're not fully focused, and that's in conjunction with not being able to perfectly and mechanically stop your squinting at a perfect point, because you're an organic being, you're an organism, so nothing is going to be static like a machine would. Like it's able to stop on a dime. Your eyes are resonating on a very small level as far as the way that your eyelids and the way that your squinting is working, because your eyes are always darting around very slightly. The eyelids are shaking as you strain the muscles around them. The muscles around your eye have that sort of tension and compression applied, and that takes conscious effort. And so as you're able to use that squinting technique, the resonance will come about, because all of that vibration from the energy being expended and the imperfect way that we're able to squint at things, the non-mechanical, very organic way that's always moving, always changing, it's going to help you see this holography almost, where the edges of things and the way that things look almost look animated to you. It's a very, very slight animation, and it took me a while to pick up on this. But if you can train yourself to see the resonance in an image, then you can work on it on yet another level. Because what we're really doing when we're illustrating is we're considering every single level that an image can work on. Is it working in terms of values? Is it working in terms of the solidified drawing? Is it working in terms of perspective? Is it working in terms of construction? Is it working in terms of the edges, like I said? So when we understand all of these fundamentals and these terminologies, and we begin to conjure imagery, then using our eyes and our squinting technique to check the resonance is yet another way to ensure that an image is reading well. So there's lots of things you can do by changing your perception when you're working. And when you're able to shift your perception, you can work in multiple planes. It's like being able to add more instrumentation to a composition, more ingredients to a dish, and understanding that on all these different profiles, it's lining up. So it's something that comes with time and practice and conscientiousness. So I just wanted to raise your awareness to that. What you're seeing me do right now is I used a selective color adjustment layer, and now I'm using a curves adjustment layer in order to get a better, just a slightly darker value scheme. It was a little too bright, a little too sunny out for the mood of the piece. I'm adding all these crows, there's a fire, there's smoke, there's like powers being activated. It's just a little too bright outside. And so using the curves layer and using the selective color layer really help to tone down some of that sunniness. I pulled out some of the warmer colors with the selective color layer, and I darkened the image using curves. And so that's not even the last time I will use those effects layers. I will stack them and continue to change the feeling of the image using those tools. So basically, we're just using all of these different tools that are embedded within our programs in order to change things and create more and more of a wholesome narrative, more and more of a wholesome consideration. So if you want something to feel a certain way, it's going to have to be brighter or darker or warmer or cooler. We're always playing between polarities as artists, and that's really how we create contrast. So contrast is one of the biggest fundamentals to consider on the picture plane. And I always want to imbue you with that idea that in order to achieve contrast, you have to understand both ends of the spectrum. You have to understand black and white, or completely lost edges and completely fine, sharp as a razor edges. Once you understand the various ends of the spectrum when it comes to any given fundamental, you're going to be able to find ways to shift each of them in your favor for whatever image you're making. So there's a lot to consider in illustration, but again, these were things that took me quite a while to figure out. And I had to watch a lot of tutorials, a lot of courses. I had to do a lot of paintings, had to fail a lot of paintings. And it really ends up costing a lot in terms of experience, because experience is the hardest one way to get the lesson. Simulation or watching something that's 2 hours long. I think this is actually almost a 3-hour tutorial altogether, 3-hour mini course, but maybe it's about 2 hours. But at any rate, it's basically it's a lot easier to gather from simulation your understanding than it is to get the experience and have to get it yourself. Obviously, you have to be the one doing it and creating it using your own hands. But when it comes to gathering information that's really important for the thing you're doing and considerations for the craft and for the process, then watching people who know and have done a lot of their own explorations will help you to gather the best of that. So just continuing to refine the main character, the focal point. Always have to keep doing that until the very end of the image, wherein we will be getting more into the final effects, and those are going to be exciting to really play with. But for now, it's about always grayscaling the image, which I have hotkeyed to Command Y or Control Y if you're a Windows user. And you have to do some settings changing, and it's a little less than desirable in terms of how the initial way to grayscale things is set up. If you don't want to go through all that, I would just create a new color layer and fill it with pure black or a saturation layer. I think either of those will work, and that will grayscale your image. You can flick that layer on and off instead. The problem with that is that you won't be able to work in grayscale because it will be color picking black and white when your image is actually in color. So it's actually, I'll make a small tutorial at the back end of this one on how you can grayscale your images and still work in color in Photoshop, because it really helps your value structure, and it's almost like one of the best cheats you can do digitally. For me, I can still paint traditionally, and I do often for gifts and sometimes for my own pleasures, but when it comes to having advantageous tools, then you just got to use them. Even if you're just learning, there's always ways to go back to the antiquated ways of doing things, the archaic ways, just for the skill development or for specific effects. But it's also wise to know when you can kind of make things easier on yourself. You see I'm using another selective color layer, just running through the black, white, and neutral colors, because it's going to help me to shift things, again, more gloomy, more moody,
more of a hazy sunlight vibe rather than a full-blown high contrast. This is a beautiful sunny day kind of idea. Next, we go to the curves layer, and as you can see based on the graph, most of the curves are in the midtones, and so I'm kind of trying to play around in that region just to create more contrast. So now you can see that I've also shot up the contrast between the blacks and the whites of the image so that the aura appears even more white, and the darker parts of the image have been crushed a little bit, toned down, and added sort of a bluish greenish tone. So that really helps to kind of shift a lot of the mood towards what I'm going for. And that's that what's missing question that we always have to keep asking ourselves. I got that question from Stephen Pressfield's book, Do the Work. There's always a part in the process wherein you have to ask what's missing. And that's how the birds got in there. That's how the smoke got in there. That's how the aura got in there. Because I'm always asking myself that question on the picture plane. And when I finally showed my friend the image, it was around this time in the process, and that's when I started to paint, or rather repaint the hand. And the image really isn't about hands or what his hands are doing, although I think I probably missed a fair amount of how I could have been expressing things more through the character, through the hands, because that's one of the best ways to do it. But that being said, it's way better to fix something that doesn't look right and just to make it look more low-key than it is to kind of redraw a whole bunch of aspects, because you really got to pick your battles. Illustrations are a longer form. This one in total probably took about 4.5, 5 hours. So it's a considerable chunk of time. And I did that over the span of a few days, just because I would get 20 minutes in here, 30 minutes in there. It was a very busy and interesting week. So I didn't have a lot of time to just sit down in one sitting and blaze through it. But the nice thing about having different settings as you're working on your illustrations is that you come back with fresh eyes and a renewed sense of purpose when you sit down. I've talked about how sometimes you get the feeling of, oh, there's so much left to do. And that thought just kind of resonates through your being and tires you out and gives you like this melancholic sort of sensation where it's kind of verging on overwhelm, because you're a little bit stressed about the image. Like you look at all the elements in the picture plane, you're like, oh, so many of these need refinement. But again, it's about picking your battles and choosing the stuff that really is going to matter when you work on it versus the stuff that can kind of fall to the wayside a little bit. And it's also thinking about what your piece is for. You know, this is a solid illustration as a demo for the course, and it's a personal illustration, you know, second and kind of otherwise, but it's mostly meant just to teach basics and ideas. And so I don't have to go all in. I don't have to use every last ounce of my power and suffer to great degrees to make something insane, because that is something that I have to kind of plan for. I would have to do far more thumbnails, far more research and references and studies, and I would have to be figuring out the sketch through a much longer process in the beginning before I commit to something and finish it for 20, 30, 40 hours. So stick with the Artist Ascent Academy, or be on the lookout on thebeginnerdrawingcourse.com for when we do work on those longer form pieces. And we will obviously time lapse. I'm not going to make you sit through a 60-hour piece, but that's just a different approach where more nuance and more ideas have to be considered. Obviously, the same fundamentals apply to a great degree, the stuff that we've talked about all throughout this illustration tutorial. But as somebody who has aspirations to illustrate more and more, you're going to have to eventually work your way up to those pieces that take you an entire week of working mostly on that piece. Some pieces take months to finish because you have other obligations and you can only sit down for 20-minute intervals. But it really just comes down to having that stick-to-itiveness and the plucky nature of not giving up. there's going to be times where you even fall flat on your face on a 20-hour piece. I mean, I have many times. And those pieces, they just fall into the ether. Nothing really happens. You spent some time, you learn some lessons, and then hopefully you shore up your fundamentals more and you create a process that, as an industry pro once told me, is a process that's based on a backstop for your own failings. So your process really should carry you through a lot of the stuff that makes you weak or makes it harder to work. So as you can see, I'm chiefly concerned with the main figure there. A lot of the paint has gone on him. A lot of the fixing work has gone into him, and it's worked pretty nicely. Now it's just about taking some of those other areas around him, making them a little bit better, but they're so far away, they're so different that he's really kind of the star of this piece. I really don't need to mess with all that stuff too much, and I end up bringing in a whole nother document to add my final effects, because the document that we're working in has gotten really large and bloated in file size because of all the layers and iterations and all the undos that it saves. So, and I'm also making backups and copies of things as I go along. So once we take it into the final layer, it's basically just about copying everything and just doing that opaquely, and then taking all the effects to it in another document. Once again, shifting about the color scheme a little bit and just really hammering home those final touches, really taking those into account as we're moving forward here. Here comes a really nice effect, and it's one of my favorite parts, and that's to let out the tetrahedrons. They're one of my favorite pieces of geometry. I learned a lot about them from the works of R. Buckminster Fuller, and what I'm doing is I just draw them in first, and then I duplicate their layer several times. The second time I duplicate the layer, I turn it into a color dodge layer, and then I Gaussian blur that color dodge layer, so it just adds a nice little faint glow to that geometry. So that's just him getting ready for battle, summoning up some tetrahedrons because he's going to need to deploy them in the midst of the foe he's going to have to face down there, who's causing all of that havoc. And the foe is unseen, so that's a nice little question for the composition, for the viewer who looks at it, like, why are the birds freaking out? Why are there floating, glowing tetrahedrons? It's just a lot of interest. And then I can use the tetrahedrons much like I used the birds. They're scattered elements that we can use to enclose our figure and kind of lead the eye toward him even more, because all of the action in this piece, if this were to be printed as a poster, is in that upper section. And the rest of it is just there to give context. It's not there to overly draw the eye or attention. What you're seeing me do right now is using a curves adjustment, but I'm lowering and amplifying the different color values, because you can choose red, green, and blue in the curves editor as well. So it's just about knowing these different menus and graphs that you can pop into to create certain effects. You'll notice that I've also Gaussian blurred the final layer and erased out using a soft brush some of that. Then I'm throwing on a noise filter by using a 50% gray fill layer and setting it to soft light, adding a noise filter to that. And then I lower the opacity or not based on if I like the noise. It's a very subtle effect. You can see it more in the final illustration than you can in the recording. After which I just create a duplicate layer. And if you select the layer in Photoshop, you can move the RGB channels by toggling them and then moving them around to create sort of a chromatic aberration. So those effects are sort of the final things I do to wrap up an image, which we've basically done. I'm now just sort of taking and adding slight detail that is leading the eye other places, just because some of that looks like it could use it based on, our focal point and whatnot. But this was a really fun one to do. This was a lot of information that I've packed into this one, and you probably have to watch it 1 or 2 times to pick up new techniques and new abilities. But the final effects are basically just adding noise using a gray soft light layer and using chromatic aberration by just double-clicking your layer. And this is only in Photoshop. In Clip Studio Paint, I don't know how to do it. And then you toggle off 1 or 2 channels and then just bump them ever so slightly by using the move tool and the arrow keys until you have an effect that is desirable. It just creates a little extra dimension and pop. So that's basically it for this one. Get ready for your assignment coming up soon, and I'll talk to you then.
Hello and welcome to the final portion of Illustration 101. In this portion, we're going to talk about the assignment, but we're also going to recap the first stuff we talked about. So basically, we covered all of this sort of terminology and theory and general principles in regards to canvas shapes and formats, the elements of the picture plane, some of the masters from the past and today. We have illustration basics, basically talking about more things regarding the picture plane, some of the focal points therein, elements, themes, and ideas, and then how to get some ideas in terms of generating those ideas or how to begin working on them at the very end with thumbnails. Then we went through the whole process of sketching those thumbnails, grabbing reference, and working our way through to the final illustration. So, that being said, we now can discuss the assignment. So sketch up to 25 thumbnails using a single word prompt or random theme generator. You can have a lot of freedom here, whatever it is you want to work on as far as an illustration goes, whether it is a single word prompt like steampunk or fighter, just anything. And then you can go to a random theme generator instead if that's not your bag. Next, choose the 5 best thumbnails, sketch them bigger and with more detail, and it should take longer than the thumbnails did, about 2 to 4 times longer. Choose the best sketch, polish it up to a finish, and once you're done, quote unquote, ask what's missing to push things even further. Lastly, add and play with various layer and filter effects in a new file before exporting your final image. So that just means to experiment a little bit with stuff that'll give it even more pop, a little more interest, and just to have those little touches and flourishes of finish that permits you to take things even further. So we're just pushing the illustrations with 4 and 5, getting most of it done by step 3, and laying the groundwork in steps 1 and 2. You also want to grab reference in step 3 because that's really important. So, that being said, you now have your Illustration 101 assignment. It has been an absolute pleasure sharing some of the process with you, even if it was just a simple demo illustration. And I can't wait to see how you strengthen your own illustrative abilities as a result of all the fundamentals we discussed. And so with that said, feel free to check out the beginnerdrawingcourse.com or to join the Artist Ascent Academy if you haven't already. Both are in the description box of the YouTube video. If you join the Academy, you can join tiers that allow you to get video feedback or one-on-one mentorship. And if you just want to grab some self-directed courses, then the beginnerdrawingcourse.com is for you. Thanks again, and happy illustrating.